Welcome to Out of the Ether with Brandon Hardy. For Halloween 2022, I knew I wanted to create something special to celebrate Hocus Pocus. One of my favorite memories from when I was younger is when they would play it on TV and then immediately after show the behind-the-scenes feature of how the movie was made. In it, they showed footage of these beautiful little Sanderson sisters puppets that were used to help create the illusion of the characters flying throughout the movie. Seeing them puppeteer these beautiful, tiny, little, highly detailed puppets was something that completely captured my imagination. I've always wanted to take an opportunity to build my own set of these highly realistic, sophisticated little puppets. However, since 2022 also coincides with the release of the sequel to Hocus Pocus, I felt the need to do something bigger. So I decided I would make it my goal to build life-size replicas of each of the Sanderson sisters in puppet form so that they could fly over the yard for Halloween. Because there really is nothing that exists like that in the world already to start from, I had to build these puppets completely from scratch. Recreating these characters in such a way where they could fly, even at life size, took lots of different skills. Sculpting, painting, stuffing, stitching, and of course, even a bit of magic. I started by making a skeleton for each puppet out of PEX pipe. PEX pipe is like a thin, lightweight version of PVC, and I just held it against my own body to measure the different parts of the puppet and make sure the skeleton was basically life-size. I was really careful to label the different parts of the puppet as I cut them up so that I wouldn't have trouble later when I went to go assemble everything. To cut the PEX pipe, I'm actually just using old gardening shears. It's pretty soft, so it's relatively easy to cut through. However, I don't necessarily recommend trying to cut it with like scissors. You do need something a little more robust than that. Sometimes I use a jigsaw, depending on how thick the PEX pipe is. In this particular case, I'm using 1/2 inch thickness. PEX pipe and PVC are measured by the inside of the tube, not by the outside of the tube. So if you go to use it in the future, just be aware of that when you're measuring. Because these puppets are meant to come together quickly and be lightweight, I'm actually just using Gorilla Tape to make flexible hinges to assemble all the pieces and keep them together. I wrap the tape around the tube and then press it together in the middle to make a lightweight hinge. Because of the way I'm using these puppets, there isn't going to be a lot of stress on the different joints throughout the puppet skeleton, so because of that, this tape is strong enough and light enough to be a good material for this project. The way that I'm taping these pieces together is intuitive to the human body. And what I mean by that is like here you see me taping what is the hip pipe to the spine pipe. So I'm just wrapping around the one to make sure that they stay together and make a nice T shape. Then I'm taping the leg onto the side of the hip to create a sort of rotating hip joint. Because these joints are so simple, the puppet at first is going to have the freedom to move basically in any direction, but once I build things out with the muscles and add the costumes, the puppet isn't going to move in ways that humans can. I'll be making sure that the arms and legs only bend the right way. Because I measured all the different sections against my own body parts and I'm just taping them together, this process goes really quickly. Each of these characters has a different body type, so I adjusted the width of the shoulders and hip bones of these skeletons to account for which character I was creating. And then I played with the skeletons a little bit to make sure they were moving nicely. Then I started again and repeated the process until I had 3 full-size skeletons. A lot of the matching pieces were not exactly the same size just because I measured very quickly, but as long as it wasn't a major size difference, it didn't really matter. Here's a quick tip if you ever are trying to find the middle of a stick without measuring. You can place your hands under opposing sides of the stick and slowly bring them together in the middle, and the point where your hands meet will be approximately the center of the stick. This helped me when I was trying to find the middle of the shoulder and hip pieces to attach to the spine, where it didn't have to be exactly measured out perfectly, but I did want it to be generally in the middle. Once those simple skeletons were complete, it was time to build out the body around them. To start, I used cheap pool noodles that I got at Dollar Tree. I cut them to length for the given section and then slid them right over the PEX pipe. These measurements were also pretty unscientific. I just held it up to the part of the body and then cut it with a pair of scissors. I cut angles at the end of some of the pool noodles in places like the elbows, shoulders, and knees to help those joints be encouraged to bend the right way. Hopefully you can see here, this is a really simple process. I'm just cutting things to be basically the right size and then making sure that the joints bend the way that they're meant to. I then moved on to the legs and repeated the exact same process. Because I'm using 1/2-inch PEX pipe, it happens to fit just inside the width of these pool noodles, so it slides on easy, but is still kind of snug and stays in place. And once I was happy with how those turned out, I repeated the process for the other skeletons. I did not intentionally color code the different characters, but it did kinda seem to happen, and it worked out well. And then I checked the movement again to make sure we didn't lose anything in doing this step. After that, I cut a long piece of pool noodle to create the spine for the puppet. I did this by taping it coming straight out of the point where the shoulders and the spine meet. What that then does is allow me to give it a nice graceful bend as I bring it back to a lower part of the spine, so it creates sort of a hump coming out of the back there. See that hump shape? And then of course the head of the puppet will sit up here. Then I replicated this step on the other 2 puppet skeletons. After that, it was time to build out the muscle of the puppets in greater detail. I did this using polyester batting and Loctite Professional Performance Spray Adhesive. This is the same spray adhesive I used last episode to make cobwebs. Notice it says web. The way this spray works is like a contact cement, so you have to spray both of the things that you want to stick together, in this case the pool noodle and the batting. Then you let them sit for a little bit to tack up, and when it feels sort of dry to the touch, then you can stick the 2 things together and they will stay. I then repeated this process, building up the different layers around each limb to get them to approximately the right size for a human proportion. Since the batting is soft and flexible, I let it overlap the different joints to fill them out and create the impression of shoulders and elbows in addition to the muscles in the arms and legs. However, because these puppets are really heavily costumed, it's not totally necessary to be perfectly accurate. Once I felt like the muscles were looking well built out, I ordered these beige-colored full-body unitards and slipped the puppets into them. While I was doing this, I shoved some extra batting into parts that I thought were maybe getting squished a little too flat. At this point, it's very much like stuffing a scarecrow, if you've ever done that, and if you haven't, well, now you'll know what it's like. To get rid of some of these bumps in the batting, I just pulled the sleeve up further and then slid it back down, and that sort of smoothed things out. I used crumpled up old newspaper to stuff the torsos of these puppets. While I went to a good amount of trouble to make sure the arms and legs looked pretty smooth, it didn't matter with the torsos because each of the Sanderson sisters has a corseted costume, so I knew when I made those later it was going to smooth everything out. Sculpting the head of each of the witches was absolutely the most challenging part of this project. Being able to recreate the likeness of an actual person in clay is something that has taken me years to figure out, but I can absolutely show you the materials and tools that I used to make it happen. I started by putting clay over a styrofoam wig form. I used an oil-based clay called plastiline. After I carved out sockets for the eyes, I rolled up a little 1-inch ball and then split it in half and put each half in one of the sockets. I wasn't being particularly scientific at this point, and that was totally fine. That's gonna come as we go and refine the sculpture. You can see at this point the face is just completely lumpy and gross, so I just went in with this tool and started pulling away parts of the clay that I knew were too dense and that shouldn't be there. I had to put it down on the table for a minute and try to smooth things out with my hands because I was using a really firm plastiline. It comes in different consistencies, but when I'm sculpting something like a human face, I really like a firm clay because when you're using a clay that's too soft, it can be really hard to make details that stay in place. Really small, complex places like eyelids and the corners of the eyes really benefit from a firm clay because you can get in there with sharp tools, make decisions, and know they're gonna stay put. In case you can't already tell, I'm sculpting Mary here, and you'll notice I'm really not worried about smoothing things out. That's going to be sort of the last step. More important to me at this stage is making sure that the different parts of the face look kind of realistic, but more important, capture the spirit of the character. Because these puppets are going to be flying, I spent a lot of time watching the scenes in the movie where they're on their broomsticks, or as the case might be, their vacuums, and noticing what kind of facial expressions they make. Mary, of course, always has her iconic offset lower lip, but when she's flying, especially on her vacuum, she's also got this sort of concerned, surprised look on her face, so I wanted to try to capture something like that as best as I could. It can be very tricky to do something like this when you're working in clay because you sort of have to imagine what it's going to look like when it has the makeup and the eyebrows and the proper colors in place, none of which exist while you're sculpting. So it is a little bit of a guessing game. Of course, I went and sculpted the faces of the other 2 witches as well, but I don't seem to have footage of that process. Because I want these puppets to be as light as possible, I'm using a thermoplastic product called Worbla to make what is essentially a hollow cast of their face. It's a lot like vacuum form, but without the vacuum. I cut a piece of Worbla big enough to cover the entire face and then heat it up with the heat gun until it's nice and melty, and then I slowly start pressing it over the details of the sculpture of the face. This is another place where it was advantageous to be using a firm clay because it was less likely that the heat from the Worbla was going to melt the features beneath it, so I knew I had a really high chance of being able to capture all the details of my sculpture in the Worbla. I have to be honest, I've never used Worbla before for anything other than making some simpler prop things, so I was very nervous trying to use it for a detailed human lifelike sculpture, and was very pleased with the results. It went better than I expected, it worked really well. I'm definitely going to be doing this again in the future. Part of what's so great about Worbla is that you can heat it up again as many times as you need, so if it cools down faster than you hoped, or you end up with a wrinkle that you don't like, you're able to go back and rework it, which makes it really great for detailed projects. For these faces, I went back many times and was able to use my heat gun to reheat the part of the Worbla that I was focused on at a given moment. One thing to be aware of though is that heat guns and styrofoam do not mix, so be careful when you're heating up the Worbla that you don't accidentally melt the styrofoam. I used a really thick layer of clay to sculpt the face, so for the most part I didn't have that issue, but I did try to be careful of it when I was heating up places like the neck, where the Worbla was going straight onto the styrofoam. I used some of my sharper sculpting tools to go back and essentially trace the sculpture through the Worbla to make sure that I really pressed it down into the most deep, detailed spots. You can see the difference that it makes in places like the eyes, where I started working on the one and hadn't worked on the other yet. There's just so much more detail in the one on the right than there is in the one on the left. This is going to matter later when I go to finish the eyes, so it's really important to take your time and make sure you capture all the detail that you want it to have. I made sure to tuck some of the Worbla underneath the neck of the styrofoam head. You'll see later why that was important. Because the human face is such an irregular shape and the Worbla only stretches so much, I did end up with some flashing here around the mouth, so I went in with an X-Acto knife once the Worbla had totally cooled and just carved it off and then sanded down the rest to make it nice and smooth. I did ultimately go back and end up using some filler to make sure that it smoothed out nicely, but I knew if I did that before I pulled the Worbla off the clay that it might just break again, so I waited and did that later. I didn't use any mold release before I put the Worbla on the clay, and maybe I should have. I'm gonna have to try that in the future. Sometimes you get lucky and the clay just pops right out, but that didn't happen here, so I used my hands and some sculpting tools to pull out as much as possible. I've repeated the same process for both Sarah and Winifred's faces. A good cost-effective measure is to only sculpt one face at a time. Once I finished the Worbla mask for one face, then I would pull out the clay and use that clay again to sculpt the next head. That way I didn't have to buy 3 faces worth of clay, I only had to buy 1. That's part of why it was valuable to pull as much of the clay out of the masks as I could after they were cooled. I did, however, need 3 styrofoam heads because I kept the styrofoam head inside the mask. I lined the mask back up properly using the parts of the Worbla that had been shaped over the ears and the bottom of the neck, and then pinned it in place with sewing pins. Then I took my X-Acto knife and carefully cut out eye holes in the mask. I tried to make sure the edges were really smooth because I wanted the eyelids to look natural even up close. And by the way, if you wanted, this whole process up till this step is perfect for making a mask you can wear on your face. But since I'm not doing that, I gotta make some eyeballs. I grabbed a couple packs of translucent Sculpey. This stuff is my favorite for making quick and simple, realistic human eyeballs. It's just the right color and it catches light in a really realistic way. I start by rolling a 1-inch ball of it in my hand. Then I use these little glass cabochons that I order online. These cabochons are 12 millimeters in diameter, which is just about the perfect size for a human iris. Then I lightly press it into the clay where I want the iris to be, and then use an X-Acto knife to gently peel it back up. This will give you a nice clear spot where the iris goes. Then I printed out some photos of human irises at 12 millimeter diameter and used this little 12 millimeter hole punch to punch them out. Then after following the instructions to bake the Sculpey, I just used nail polish clear coat to start assembling everything. I realized I didn't show myself baking the clay, so that's why I want to make sure you know it is baked by this point. Then it's time to grab some glass cabochons again and make sure that they are clean and clear as a bell. I glued them down to the eyeball using the nail polish, essentially sandwiching the printed iris in between. Make sure it's centered properly and doesn't slide around. Then I take some fuzzy red yarn and pull off some of the fuzz to make the little tiny veins in the eyeball. These puppets are going to be seen at a little bit of a distance, so this is absolutely an excessive step, but I take some pride in the eyeballs that I make and want them to look as realistic as possible. All I do is paste the fuzz onto the side of the eyeball with the nail polish and then just drag it around until it feels like an organic vein shape. This step can be easy to overdo, so make sure that you don't use too much fuzz or your eyes are going to look totally bloodshot. I make sure to give the eyeballs a couple top coats with the nail polish because you can never be too shiny with a real wet human eye. If sculpting the faces is the most challenging step, painting them is the second most challenging. The little details in the makeup can make or break the character. I used some really cheap false eyelashes on these puppets, and it adds so much to the realism. While I was painting these details, I had my laptop open off to the side with the movie playing so that I could refer to different scenes and different shots to make sure that all the details looked right in 3 dimensions. While I want these puppets to look really realistic, I also knew they were going to be seen from a little bit of a distance, so in some places I let myself push the paint job a little bit more just to make sure the expressions were visible. I also thought it was more important to make sure the expressions looked right from below rather than straight on, because with the puppets flying overhead, that's how most people were going to see them. Winifred had a bit of an extra step because she has her very iconic teeth, and I didn't like the way that I sculpted them, so I actually just went to Spirit Halloween and bought the fake teeth that they sell there that you can use in your mouth when you dress up as her, and just crazy glued them into the mask. Note that I did not use hot glue. Hot glue might heat up the warbler again and distort the sculpt of the face. By the way, I apologize for the really freaky imagery in this part of the episode, especially here with Winnie having no eyeballs in, yet it's very disconcerting. By the way, I think I haven't mentioned it yet. To paint these faces, I started with a base coat of a peach-colored spray paint, and then I'm using acrylic paint to paint in all the details like the blush and lipstick and eyeshadow. I wanted Winifred to look a little bit angry, so I dry brushed a little around her face to make her look more flush. I also used some darker colors to accent the shadows in places like the nostrils and laugh lines. But the most crucial step for making a puppet feel alive is the positioning of the eyeballs. If there is any step not to rush, it is this one. Because I want these puppets to be realistic, it is important that the eyes feel like they are making direct eye contact with their audience. I repositioned these eyeballs a ton before I finally locked them in with crazy glue. I knew the eyes were right when looking at the puppet's head struck fear in my heart. I also hit the teeth with some nail polish to make them look shiny and wet. The wigs that I used for these puppets weren't actually all that fancy because I knew they were going to have their riding hoods up. For Mary and Winifred, I used the wigs they sell at Spirit Halloween, and then for Sarah, I found a cheap blonde wig on Amazon. When it came time to costume these puppets, I'd realized I'd forgotten to give them feet. So really quickly I fixed this by cutting some pool noodles to fit in the shoes that I'd found at the thrift store for these puppets, and then putting a hole in that where I could slide it over the PEX pipe at the bottom of the leg and then just duct tape it in place. Because I am using real shoes for these puppets, I made sure to secure the feet really well because I didn't want the weight of a shoe pulling off a foot and hitting somebody in the head. I then slid the leg of the bodysuit over the foot and stitched that in place. I had also wrapped the ankle in some batting just to give it a little more shape. Then before I attached any of the shoes for real, I made sure to put the corresponding stockings on each of the puppets. Because I think the fabrics and textures in each of the witches' costumes are so great in the movie Hocus Pocus, I decided to replicate the costumes from scratch. However, because I'm putting them on a puppet and not an actual human person who needs to be able to take them on and off, I was able to cut a lot of corners and use a lot of clever tricks to make it easier. I am not really a costume maker and don't know how to tailor things properly to real people, but the advantage of a puppet is that you can just sew things in place a lot of the time, and it doesn't have to be exact, you can tailor it onto the puppet. So the way that I operated for most of these costumes is essentially making a series of tubes that either fit the arms or the torsos of the puppet, and then hand stitching them in place, and then just bunching up as needed, and then stitching up the bunching to make sure that they sort of fell roughly where they needed to fall. In the case of the purple pleating here, in the middle of Winifred's dress, I literally just tacked it in place on the bodysuit. I just did a couple simple stitches by hand just to get it exactly where I want it and make it stay. This is essentially how I built the costumes for all 3 of these witches. I'm basically just draping fabric over the puppet where it seems like it should go, and stitching it by hand to stay in place once I feel like I like how it looks. And just like before, I had my computer off to the side with a whole bunch of images of the costumes just to make sure I was getting the details right. Because these characters have such big flowing capes, I was able to cheat a lot around the back and just tighten up the costume knowing the cape would hide it. This created the impression that the garments were all created to fit the puppets really, really well, but actually they're just tightened in place. You can see I did the exact same thing here with Mary's blouse, where I essentially just stitched a tube, draped it over the torso, made some tubes for sleeves, tacked them on at the shoulder, and made it look like a cohesive garment, but actually it isn't. Even things like the vest, I basically just draped the fabric over the puppet, eyeballed the pattern that I thought it needed, cut off the excess, and then just stitched what was left directly onto the puppet. Now, if these were for a professional project, I would need to make a pattern, but because I'm only making these once, I didn't bother. I got crafty with some spray dyes to recreate some of the more complex fabrics like those on Winifred's cloak. In the movie, her cloak is made with a dark green velvet that's hand-dyed with some lighter greens and some dark purples. But I wasn't in the position to hand-dye all of that, so I just sprayed some colors on. And then I super cheated with the patterns on her cloak. I made stencils and then used tan and gold spray paint to dust the patterns onto the fabric. This gave all the patterns the bleached look that they have in the movie, but spared me having to actually bleach the fabric. This essentially let me copy and paste parts of the pattern to different parts of the costume. I then did the same thing that I've been doing so far on the different parts of the costume, where I just draped it over the puppet and stitched it into place. The dark green velvet that I ended up using had a little bit of stretch to it, which was really nice because it gave the impression that the cloak was really well fitted to the puppet, even though I was just cheating by sewing it up around the back like I've been doing so far. Once that was all secured and looking good around front, I followed the same process to create the sleeves. All of the witches' costumes are layered with lots of fabric, and some of it looks very old, so I made sure to leave lots of frayed edges and actually encourage them to fray even more. Once I felt like things were coming together, I made sure to go back and add all the little accent pieces like beadings and tassels and threads that run through the different costumes. For Mary's apron, I actually used this throw blanket that happened to be similar colors and textures. I cut off a big piece of it and once again stitched it directly onto the puppet. To make the little rings that hang off of Mary's vest, I found these little bamboo rings and spray painted them gold. I almost used shower curtain rings, but the bamboo gave it some texture that I really liked. And speaking of texture, Mary's costume in particular has a lot of it. I used this Sureform shaver tool to go in and pull at the fabric, which makes it look extra tattered and old. In a pinch, you can do the same thing with the cheese grater, just maybe don't grate cheese with it afterward. The bottom of her skirt is particularly distressed, so I just went in with a scissor and tried to cut it up and make it look as messy as I could. I made a point to not cut any straight lines, I just made it as rough and jagged as possible. Then I went back in with that Sureform shaver and just tried to pull the threads apart. Steps like this are important to make it look like the character has been wearing this costume for years. When I'm distressing a costume like this, I try to think about it logically too, and figure out which parts of the costume would have the most wear and tear based on how the character would be wearing it. I find this process kind of meditative and a lot of fun, so I let myself really go for it, especially with a costume like Mary's where it is beat up and old. You can see the difference that it makes. I also went in and low-lighted some areas with some walnut wood tone spray just to make it look dirtier. To tell you the truth, there is one part of Sarah's costume I did not make from scratch. I couldn't find the right fabric for her bodice, so I used one from a Spirit Halloween costume. But I did go back in with some acrylic paint to distress it and make the color more accurate. And now, the capes. I used silk Cabochons, which is the same fabric they used in Hocus Pocus. It's lighter than air and it moves like magic. I have a really simple trick I use to make these capes. I start by stitching a rectangle the length and width I want the cape to be. Then I make sure my sewing machine is set to straight stitch. Then I make sure the length is set to the highest possible setting. The high length and straight stitch are both essential. Then I do a straight stitch across the top of the fabric where the neck is going to be, completely straight across, never backing up to lock the stitch. What you end up with is a long top thread and bottom thread at the end of your fabric. Separate these threads and start pulling one of them. It doesn't matter which, but just pick one. Because the straight stitch is so long, what'll happen is the fabric will start to slide down and gather along the other thread. Then you just keep cinching it down and make sure it gathers nicely all the way across the fabric. It's worthwhile to be patient and go slow with this process because if you pull too hard, you can break the thread and then you have to start all over. You can see it gives it a really nice pleated look, almost like a really dramatic curtain. Then, before you do the next step, you want to make sure this fabric is still long enough to fit around either your neck or the neck of whatever's going to be wearing it. I just tested it on myself. I made some really quick, simple witches' hoods by just folding some linen in half and stitching it up the back. Then I laid the neck of the hood over the gathered neck of the cape, stitched them together, and that was it. Each of the witches in Hocus Pocus famously has their own unique writing device. Winifred has her broom, Sarah has her mop, and of course, Mary has her vacuum. I found this one for $20 on Facebook Marketplace, but it was too heavy to actually fly with the puppet. So I just used some of the leftover Warbler from the witches' faces and essentially made a hollow cast of the actual Hoover vacuum. This didn't exactly go perfectly. I not only stretched the Warbler probably a little too far, but I also ended up having trouble peeling it off the vacuum because I was basically putting plastic on plastic. So in the future, I'll probably use some sort of mold release if I ever go to do something quite like this exactly again. So in the end, while I did end up with a pretty decent cast of the vacuum, it also ended up under Mary, and you didn't really see it. What you did see, though, was the vacuum bag, and luckily Joann's had something that was almost the exact same pattern as the movie. Once that was done, it was time to get the witches flying. I know I said something else was the most difficult part of this project. However, I think that's only because I blocked out how difficult this part was. These puppets are essentially giant marionettes, and I strung them from black Dacron. Dacron is a fishing line that comes in lots of sizes and weights. Here, I'm using 130-pound line. The puppets are only 15 pounds each, so it's more than strong enough. You can see how thin it is. It's remarkable. And unlike regular fishing line, it's not shiny, so it just disappears in the dark. However, it did give me some headaches with the pulleys. Because it's so thin, it kept jumping out of the track and catching on the side of the pulley. I tried about a million different things to work around this, and the one thing that ended up actually working was tying off the Dacron to a thicker rope that was thick enough to pass through the pulleys without jumping the track. This rope I used had a camouflage pattern that worked pretty well. So what I did was essentially create a complex 4-point clothesline system with 3 points high up in the trees and 1 point down low where I could reach it. 2 of those high points were up in trees on opposite sides of the yard. The third high point was up in a tree way in the back of the yard. The purpose of this third point was to direct the returning rope far away from where the witches were flying. So then I was able to cut out a section of rope between the 2 points in the front of the yard and replace that with the really thin Dacron. Then in the middle of that Dacron is where I put the point that the witches hung down from. What this meant is that they were hanging from one string of Dacron that went about 7 feet above their head. Then from that point, the Dacron went about 20 feet in both directions before it got tied off to the rope. What that meant was that the witches had a lot of distance that they could fly horizontally and vertically before the knots in the rope would hit any of the pulleys. That also meant that any string thicker than the Dacron was way out of the line of sight and hidden in the dark. I was really particular when setting up the lighting to make sure that I didn't hit the rope or the Dacron with any light. What you see here is the camouflage colored rope getting hit directly with an orange light. It's obviously very apparent, so I made sure to go in and adjust everything to make sure that I lit essentially off to the side and behind. Doing this makes the rope essentially see-through to your eye in person. It's even harder to notice when it's moving because it just blurs. I did the same thing here. This is one of the points where the rope gets tied off to the Dacron. You can see the Dacron is basically already invisible, and then when you take the light off the rope and make sure you're lighting the trees behind it, it also basically just disappears. Look at that. Now, the fourth point in the system was the most important because that's where it came down to the ground where I could reach it and control the witches flying. This up and down motion gave a little bit of bounce and swing to the witches' flight pattern, and then of course moving left to right helped them move left and right across the yard. I actually had to stitch a couple ropes together to make one long continuous one. That way there weren't any knots in the ropes to keep them from moving through the different pulleys except for where they met the Dacron. I also had what I called, for some reason, the wild rope, and that was this rope here that had a carabiner at the end clipped over the clothesline. What the carabiner did was essentially allow the clothesline to pass through left and right, but it gave me the opportunity to pull the clothesline forward and back and to pull it down. Being able to pull the rope side to side like that gave the witch's flight pattern a third dimension, so it didn't just look like they were going back and forth across the x-axis, they also had some ability to go against the y-axis. Because the witches were hanging 7 feet below the horizontal line, just a little bit of movement on that horizontal line got them swinging forward and back, and this really helped hide the fact that they were going across the yard basically in a straight line and created the impression that they could fly anywhere. The pulley nearest the wild rope was itself on a pulley that had a counterweight at the other end. That meant if I pulled down on the wild rope, the counterweight would go up in the air and the witch that was on the line would come down to me so I could take them on and off the line. Because of that counterweight, I was able to keep tension in the clothesline system the entire time, no matter whether it was up or down. That tension brought the witches back up to their full flying height by just letting go of the wild rope. Here's another look at how well the line disappeared. You can only see where the rope is highlighted by my flashlight, and the Dacron doesn't even register in the flashlight at all. hope you've enjoyed this first Patreon exclusive episode of Out of the Ether with Brandon Hardy. This video took a lot more to put together than I anticipated that it would. As you can see, this was a large project to tackle for only my second video in the series. I appreciate your unbelievable patience and want you to know that the project for episode 3 has already been completed. The video's been shot, now I just need to edit it together, so that should hopefully be to you pretty soon. In the meantime, happy Halloween, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, and thank you.